Hi, everybody. My name is Mark Pickett. I'm the Tech Transfer Program Manager for SAE Government Technologies, and we're back for another LinkedIn Live event. I'm pretty excited about today. I have Alec Sorensen here, founder and CEO of TradeSpace, and we're going to be talking about creating a wider pool of technology for government acquisition, as it is very difficult to keep pace with innovation in so many different areas. Alec, welcome.
Thank you, Mark. It's great to be here.
Alec, so excited to have you here. Please just maybe give the audience background on yourself, and then let's jump in and talk about TradeSpace.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, again, it's really exciting to be here and to be talking to you, Mark. A little bit about my background. As you said, I founded TradeSpace about 5 years ago. Prior to that, I cut my teeth in management consulting. So I spent about 5 years at a DC-backed consulting firm called Avocent, working with some of the largest aerospace and defense companies in the world on driving growth and innovation. So I started out in mergers and acquisitions, helping with large industry-changing acquisitions. And when Lockheed Martin bought Sikorsky helicopters, for example, we got involved in that. And my first exposure to technology commercialization and IP really came through that lens of M&A. So we'd work with these companies that would make these large acquisitions, which typically included really large portfolios of innovative IP and technology. And those acquirers, it turns out, didn't know a whole lot about the IP that they were acquiring. And we learned very quickly that this was common kind of across the industry, that there is just an enormous amount of technology and IP, trapped not only with aerospace and defense companies, but across the whole market, and universities and national labs. And as the commercial space became more and more relevant for government, there was obviously an enormous amount of IP there. And so the genesis for TradeSpace was to develop a platform that enabled organizations that are looking to interact with that IP and that technology ecosystem to better identify and engage with IP generators, and then also to help those IP generators better understand the value of their own technology and to connect with the right partners. And so that's what we've been doing at TradeSpace. And we've been really fortunate to work with some of the leading global innovators, companies like Raytheon, Northrop Grumman, IBM, universities like MIT, quite a few folks at DoD. So it's been a really interesting journey, and it's just exciting to be an enabler of technology commercialization for the government. So I'll kind of pause there and turn it back over to you, Mark.
Well, thank you very much, Alec. You mentioned some really, powerful organizations, quite well known in the aerospace and defense industries. Could you talk a little bit about some of the use cases and maybe why TradeSpace is differentiated as a tech scouting partner?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the best way to start is to get kind of to the root of the problem that a lot of these organizations face. Whether you're a Fortune 500 company like Raytheon, or you're a government lab or a government acquisition agency. I think one of the things that is quite well talked about is the fact that DoD is no longer the only source of innovation in most technology areas, and in a lot of emerging tech spaces, it may actually lag the commercial world. And we all kind of understand parts of the problem, right? There's a whole lot of commercial innovation going on, and DoD is not sure, how to access that, or even an organization, a Fortune 500 company. And there's the problem of there being a lot of technology. But I think the other problem that's not talked about quite as much is the challenge of translating requirements and problems into technologies. So it used to be, back when DoD was a leader across all these different spaces, they come up with a warfighter challenge, right? It might be, we need more stealth capability, or we need to up armor a certain vehicle. And they could go to the folks in their own labs who could kind of mull on that problem statement, and they'd probably be able to think about the 3 or 4 technologies that would apply. Or, very worst case scenario, they'd go out to, the 4 or 5 primes, talk to the folks at Skunkworks, say, hey, we have this problem. What are, can you tell us the technology that's going to fix it? Today, it's a really different problem where we don't even know the different technologies that could solve many of the requirements of the problem statements that DoD or these large organizations have. And the organizations that have the technology, they're not super familiar with DoD. And so they're not actively bringing these to the right stakeholders. And so the challenge becomes, again, how do we take a problem statement, whatever that might be, and actually translate it to a set of technologies that might solve that problem? And then how do we find those technologies in the market? And that's really, I think, where TradeSpace spends a lot of our time, which is to develop a platform that brings in data on all of the IP in the world, every patent, every publication, and kind of develops a knowledge graph to be able to take a problem statement and essentially use some fairly powerful AI language models to say, okay, well, within this problem statement, we can essentially identify these 6 technology areas that we think are going to map to it. And we're able to then go out and identify all of the IP in the world that aligns with those technology areas. So within a couple of clicks, we can go from a problem statement to the 50 or 100 organizations that have actually generated IP that addresses that need or that problem statement. And then we can even further triage that. We can look at kind of the quality of the IP, the strength of the signal. But ultimately, what that enables us to do is to be able to take a problem statement and connect it to the right stakeholders. And that's kind of another piece of the puzzle that I think really sets us apart. Not only is it the speed at which we can quickly kind of get to a set of providers, a set of technology solutions, but it's the actionability of that. The fact that we maintain our own network of thousands and thousands of companies, tech scouts, technology leads, licensing leads, corp dev leads. And so it's not just being able to say, oh, well, we think that whoever the case may be, Meta has a solution that actually might meet this need, but it's to be able to say, well, you need to talk to so-and-so at Meta who leads this business unit that's actively solving this problem, maybe for a very different market. So that's really what our focus has been. Again, how do we leverage speed, signal strength, and actionability to connect problem statements to the right technologies that are going to potentially solve that?
Absolutely. Thank you for that. As you're aware, Alec, we conducted a technology scouting competition last fall in 2022, and we solicited 19 different organizations, and TradeSpace won. And what I remember mostly about the evaluation of the judges through the valid eval process and portal that we leveraged during that competition was the actionable data quality. Not that it was just, doing a Google search and coming up with names, like you said earlier, company names, but actual points of contact, and the speed at which you and your team are able to get at that data is amazing. And so what that allows us to do as government technologies is at any point in time, we can pivot and conduct that tech scouting sprint and identify intellectual property, national labs, universities, innovators in the space in a particular technology focus area. Maybe you could talk a little bit about the competition that we went through last fall, and in your own words, describe what you saw in the evaluation.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, first of all, Mark, I think you mentioned the valid eval platform, and I just want to briefly kind of talk about that being a really, I think, positive experience. And as a company that does quite a bit of work with the government, we've been through a lot of different types of acquisition processes, run a lot of different ways. And as you and I'm sure everybody else who's on this call knows, these acquisitions are oftentimes a black box. And especially for a smaller company, we don't have a dedicated contracting team. We'll submit these, and I would say we're pretty good at it as well. But even then, we don't know if we don't win a contract, we don't know, were we simply disqualified because we didn't submit the right form, or was this a real qualitative shortcoming that we have and that we need to address? And so being able to very quickly kind of get a response from you and your team through valid eval, in a rubric format to say, okay, well, these were the 4 criteria that we said we were going to judge you on. This is how you mapped against those criteria. That to us was incredibly helpful. And I think as we move forward with this engagement and continue to work together, not only the positive feedback, but I think where, you said, oh, this is where you could even tune it up a little bit more. That's going to help us proactively kind of be a better partner as we go into that. So I think, for those listening who are involved in the acquisition space, coming from a small business who, interacts with the government and with contractors quite often, I think, this is a tool that's been really, really helpful for us. So that's my short plug for the Valid Eval or similar platforms. But when it comes to the actual process, as you mentioned, I think the things that we really wanted to talk about and that I think resonated were, again, the speed of the analysis. And this is critical for a number of reasons. I mean, so thinking back to my days in consulting, we would do a whole lot of market analyses. We'd have a company come to us, say, hey, we really want to look at the virtual reality space. Can you help us understand, what that ecosystem looks like? And, the challenge was that would be a 4 to 6 month engagement. We'd have analysts looking, and by the time we delivered it, and ultimately by the time it got briefed up to the right person who could make a decision, that was probably stale, right? There's probably 4 or 5 companies that had been founded since then that were providing, virtual reality technology. So what I think any organization that's trying to access emerging technology ecosystems needs to recognize is that it's a moving picture. And so in order to engage with that, you need to be able to access data in a really dynamic way. So that might be just having access to a very quick snapshot to be able to say, hey, let's look at this space and get feedback in a day. It might also be real-time monitoring. So not only what is the picture today, but how can we continually be updated as something changes in this picture? Because it is going to change a lot faster than the pace of government acquisition. So that's something that, again, we spend a lot of time on. We bring in our data twice a week. So we try to be pretty current. And not only that, but we've developed a lot of tools to be able to spotlight changes. So it's not only bringing in new data, but how do we surface for the customer when something relevant to them changes? So if you're looking at, and I'll stick with virtual reality, how can we say, oh, well, not only did the companies that we're already tracking, maybe develop some new things, but here's a couple new companies, and we're able to tell you that they're new and that they're relevant for you. So that speed is really important. But again, I think even more important than that is actionability. And I know that was the feedback we got, that, the fact that this is actionable is important. And it's great to hear that that's a priority. There's a couple of factors that underpin actionability. And I think the biggest one, and this is the challenge for anybody who's trying to identify technologies by looking at, Google searches, by interacting with marketing materials, it's not a great high quality signal for where an organization actually has real technology. And I'll give an example. So we're based in Silicon Valley, and there tends to be kind of a lot of buzz around different technologies. And I remember a time a couple of years ago where all of a sudden all the funding started going towards artificial intelligence, and obviously today that makes sense. But even 3 or 4 or 5 years ago, that was a big push, and there was a pivot point where I think every company, every startup out here changed their marketing material and did a find replace for data science to artificial intelligence. And so you had all these companies that had no real innovation in the AI space that were marketing themselves as AI for X or AI for Y. And so it's a real challenge for anybody who's looking from the outside in to actually identify where there's a meaningful partner that has something that's differentiated. And so by looking at where there's been IP generation, we can actually see where a company has placed kind of a flag in the ground to say, look, this is technology we're protecting. We've made an investment in it. And we can actually, to an extent, kind of quantify that investment by looking at the size of the IP portfolio they've built around that, by looking at how highly cited that IP is kind of within the field. There's a whole lot of other metrics that we can assess to essentially judge what is the quality of the signal we're getting. If a company like IBM files a patent, a single patent in their portfolio for virtual reality out of all 100,000 patents, that might not be as meaningful. But if we see, a relatively small company all of a sudden, grow their portfolio by 20% in a certain area, we see that that's highly referenced. That to us is a really strong signal that this is somebody who we should be talking to. So that, I think, to us is really important. And then, Mark, I think the last thing I'll mention, again, is not actually, where I think we did super well, but, where we got feedback in terms of things that we could, work on. And I think one of the pieces of feedback was, this is great. We've got this long list of companies. not every one of those are companies we would want to talk to. It's maybe a little bit over inclusive. There's some really big companies that everybody obviously knows about. We don't necessarily need to see them there. Maybe we don't want to see companies that have really small portfolios that aren't doing much. And that I think underpins one of the most important parts of kind of how we work with people, which is that fine tuning of the criteria. What's I think unique about our approach is that there's all these different levers we can pull to increase the quality of the outputs. So we might have a customer say, look, we're only looking for US based companies that are under a certain size in terms of revenue, and that have made a meaningful investment, over a certain part of their portfolio in developing this technology. And so that's one of the cool things is we can kind of take this iterative approach to honing in and getting to a much higher quality feedback. And it can be back and forth. We can send, a list of companies through our platform, and you can say, well, these companies aren't relevant to us for reasons X, Y, and Z. And that can train our algorithm to then get even more accurate. So that was a piece where I was actually really happy that, we got feedback to say, look, we would definitely want to tune this a little bit, because that means there's an interest in investing and making this as good as possible.
Yeah, that's a good point, Alec, because in our case, if we wanted to go out and recruit members, we would, our team's only so big. So we would, need to sort of fine tune the results, narrow the focus into a particular area or by some criteria so that we could, limit that range of companies that we would need to reach out to seek bringing them on as new members. So that's a good point. And good part of TradeSpace is that you can fine tune, you can narrow the field if you need to. Alec, how old is TradeSpace?
So we've been around for about 5 years now.
So even in just 5 years, can you talk to, or maybe not, but I want to double click on something you said a minute ago, and that was, things are changing so rapidly. So just in that 5 years, can you just sort of talk about your experience in how quickly things are evolving, and the speed at which they're evolving? And I want to remind the audience, if you have a comment or a question, go ahead and type it in the LinkedIn page if you want. So Alec, yeah, I'm just curious to know your perspective on the speed of innovation.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, look no further than kind of all of the hype around generative AI, I think, to see how something can how a technology can change paradigms, in the course of a couple months. And so, for those, I would imagine most people are familiar now with ChatGPT. They've seen it on LinkedIn, they've played with maybe the interface, but for those who aren't, it's a platform sponsored by a group called OpenAI that leverages just really, really large language models. They've essentially processed everything up on the internet through, I think, 2020 maybe, in order to create a chatbot that can answer questions in a way that really replicates the human, and in fact, kind of in some cases might go beyond kind of human knowledge, because it's able to leverage the internet. And so they released this chatbot essentially for anybody to try. I think this was in November, maybe December. And for those like me who kind of track the startup space, there's an organization called Y Combinator. It's one of the largest, most prominent startup accelerators in Silicon Valley. Every year they have a cohort of a couple hundred startups. All of them raise large sums of money from the big VC investors around here. And what was really remarkable to me, within a month of that announcement, 50%, I think maybe even more, of YC's cohort was companies using generative AI, essentially tapping into that for different use cases. And so this is an area where we're seeing generative AI for accounting, generative AI for finance, for risk management. These are companies that this wasn't even a market or a use case 2 months ago, that all of a sudden are going to really change how organizations approach these business functions. So on the technology side, I mean, I think that really highlights it. There's also other fundamental changes that we've seen in how companies do business and how organizations do business. I remember early on in the company's lifetime, we were working with a large US-based automotive manufacturer. I'll kind of leave it at that. And talking with them, they weren't really interested in seeing how they could plug their technology into other use cases, or even how they could interact with external sources of innovation. They're essentially, what we heard from them is, look, we build cars. That's our main business. And we're good at that. We know all the suppliers, all the people who make tires, all the people who make transmissions. We're pretty satisfied with that. And we're focused on kind of squeezing the last bit of efficiency out of that. And what we've seen over the last year or two is both of those paradigms have shifted tremendously. So first of all, they've realized that they're not an automotive company. They're not making cars. They're making platforms that have really advanced 5G communications antennas, that have virtual reality, that are of course leveraging advanced sensors for autonomous driving. And they also realize that they don't have all those capabilities in-house. And while they're great at managing that traditional automotive supply chain, they had no idea what was out there, keeping track of this external innovation ecosystem for 20 different emerging technologies with cross-cutting uses that weren't necessarily even marketing themselves to the auto industry, was an overwhelming challenge. So all of a sudden we saw them, and a lot of companies like them, having to rethink how they engage with those innovation ecosystems. They couldn't rely on companies dedicated to providing a technology to their market space coming to them. They had to go out and find people who had maybe developed something for a different application. So that was really, I think, interesting. Another change we've seen just over the last year, and maybe even less, I think, is also how companies think about using their own technology. Again, as we've seen kind of markets flatten out a little bit, what we saw at first was companies trying to cut costs, slimming down their headcount, maybe cutting software that they're using. But what's been really interesting is we're now seeing at the management level, companies are looking to get more value out of their existing IP assets, which means thinking about them not just as a legal asset that we use to protect from infringement, but how do we actually find other companies that might be able to get value out of that IP? So we're seeing really large companies, big Fortune 500 industrials companies, technology companies, proactively saying, look, I want to plug my my technology and my IP into another use case. We recently saw a big defense company sell a lot of its IP into the augmented reality space in a really interesting transaction. So I think the message for folks in the government acquisition world is, yes, we obviously want to be focused on those innovative startups that are doing things, but there may also be a lot of non-traditional companies at a larger level that have really interesting technology that they're looking to deploy outside of areas where they've typically deployed it. And that could be a really interesting opportunity to bring new capabilities to the warfighter. So I'll kind of leave it there.
Absolutely. That's a good point. So I know you've got some strong past performance with some government agencies. One in particular that I would like to talk about is our Air Force Research Laboratory. Can you talk a little bit about that work without revealing too much, I guess?
Yeah, no, absolutely. And this was through the AFWERX SBIR program. So again, our core focus is on technology commercialization. And so it's always great to actually be able to participate as a recipient of the DoD's focus on agile acquisition, on enabling technology commercialization. So we worked with the Air Force's Technology Transfer and Transition Office. So it's a central office that is responsible for ensuring that the billions of dollars of R&D that the Air Force Research Lab spends on new technology actually leads to some of that technology getting to the warfighter. And the challenge is that these labs are developing really fascinating technologies that are oriented towards real warfighter problems. However, the labs aren't manufacturers, they're not producers. And so in order for these innovations to get to the warfighter, that technology needs to be transitioned back to industry so that companies can actually commercialize the technology and bring it to the warfighter. The challenge being that the Air Force Research Lab has a bunch of different directorates. They have thousands of patents they've filed, And the central group didn't really have a whole lot of visibility across all the different labs in terms of what technology they had. Anecdotally, I think AFRL knows where they've made bets, but they didn't have much quantitative knowledge on where is our IP group in terms of real technology areas. And so we were able to leverage our platform to catalog all of the Air Force Research Labs IP, to categorize it, by different technology area, and then to leverage some of our algorithms to understand which of those technology areas were the strongest. Where do we have really strong technology with high commercialization potential? The other challenge that the Air Force Research Lab had is, while they have all this technology, they have limited bandwidth to try to push it out. And so they actually needed to make bets on which technologies, first of all, aligned with their strategic priorities, and second of all, had the greatest likelihood of commercialization. And so they were able to leverage our platform to place some of those bets, to understand where there was capability, and then to be able to package that IP and identify which companies were the right partners. So kind of the opposite of what we talked about earlier, which is, instead of taking a company or an organization's problem statement and finding the IP, we can take the IP and we can actually find where the problem might be. We can analyze other companies' IP generation and innovation patterns and see where they have gaps and white spaces. And so the Air Force was able to leverage that to actually identify a lot of potential partners and be proactive about bringing industry in to transition some of that technology out. And so, that was, I think, a really rewarding experience to actually see some of that happen, to see, for example, AFRL New Mexico, license some really interesting technology into a space that they weren't planning to serve the warfighter in terms of counter UAS. And I think what's also really exciting to see happen is when you make that happen, when you provide the infrastructure that brings industry and DoD research labs together, even if the initial conversation is around how do we commercialize this piece of DoD technology, it also leads to a better conversation and dialogue about what capabilities and problems both sides have. And once you get the smart people in the room from both sides, all of a sudden you realize all the other opportunities for collaboration. And so that's really what we like to facilitate. We want to bring those two together and then kind of let the magic happen. And I think that's one of those areas where we're really excited to kind of partner with SAE to see kind of your ability to take the infrastructure that we've created, but then actually introduce the kinetic energy into the equation to actually bring those two sides together and to facilitate that collaboration and that commercialization. That, I think, is a really powerful combo. And so, building off of what we've done for AFRL, I think there's a real opportunity to take the infrastructure and the technology that we've provided, but then actually bring in the ecosystem building and the facilitation to make that happen. I think that becomes a really powerful equation.
Excellent. So really your capability is a two-way street that supports tech transition and transfer, both
Exactly.
spin in and spin out. And so I think as a consortium management organization, SAE Government Technologies really sees tremendous value in your capability to make sure that not only are we staying at pace with innovation and we're keeping our technology pool fresh, but we're also identifying potentially weak areas in our consortia and then leverage our capability to go out and find new members that can bring innovation and new tech to the consortium. So I think that's fantastic. And in the future, a partnership intermediary agreement where, you're facilitating tech transfer and transition, knowing that you can leverage your capability to support that activity as well is good to know. I think we have a question from the audience. So exactly how did you introduce your technology to the Air Force? This particular person in the audience states, my background is in the DoD. My background is the DoD only listens to something that a DoD thinks of first. Have they changed? Sorry about that, sir. I'm sure I shredded that question, but do you understand the question, Alec?
Yeah, I mean, and I think, as somebody who's worked with the DoD for a while now, it certainly can be challenging. And it was really interesting transitioning from a role where we were working with really large government contractors to, being that small business that's kind of trying to interact with the government. And I do think that the AppWorks SBIR program, and there's other of these OTAs, other transaction authorities that are enabling the government to be faster and more dynamic about how they acquire technologies, and to take a little bit more risk. So I think, AppWorks, I don't have the number off the top of my head, but they award a pretty large number of phase one SBIRs for just technologies that might have a use case somewhere in the Air Force. So that, I think, is a great way to kind of get a foot in the door. But for us, there is still a significant amount of effort in terms of talking to DoD stakeholders. We spent weeks on the phone with every tech transfer lead at every lab directorate in the Air Force, really kind of listening to them to hear what their biggest pain points were. And so for us, it wasn't going door to door saying, hey, this is what TradeSpace does. We're really good at it. And this is why you should use us. Instead, we tried to orient it around, hey, what's really hard for you? What are you not doing today that you really wish you could be doing? And we were fortunate in that those pain points tended to align pretty well with what we were already doing. And so it made it, I think, a little bit easier to say, hey, you told us what you needed, and here we're able to provide it. So it is kind of, them thinking of it first. They at least thought of the problem. And we were able to say, yes, thank you for all that feedback. Because of your feedback, we were able to kind of adapt our solution in a way that's going to meet that need. And so that, I think, to us was really important, is listening and doing just a whole lot of requirements gathering and customer discovery, and then framing our solution that way.
Thanks for that. In our case, our experience with our OTA with ACC Warren and Ground Vehicle Systems Center here at the Detroit Arsenal, periodically we have affinity group meetings with particular technology areas within GVSC, and we facilitate dialogue that allows them to tell us what their problem statements are. And then we take those problem statements and come out to industry and academia looking for solutions, and are able to respond to those problem statements with unsolicited information or documentation, and then the government has awareness about what technology exists in a particular point in time, and then they can decide whether to try to fund that activity and turn it into a prototype project for development. So if we, through that facilitation, that affinity group discussion, we learned that, wow, there's a problem statement we haven't seen before. We can come out to you, Alec, and leverage your capability to say, okay, here's a new problem statement. Who has already solved this, or who's worked on this, and what kind of intellectual property is out there to address this problem?
Yeah, that makes sense. And I think it goes to the type of acquisition as well. If you're, trying to bid for an established program of record, you can probably bet that, there's been a lot of risk reduction already, and the government knows exactly what they want. But it's targeting these areas where the government has specifically selected an acquisition vehicle like an OTA, like an SBIR, to be able to try new things. And I think, in my view, those customers they're looking for new technology to solve a problem, as opposed to looking for this exact technology that solves the problem they have. So yeah, I think OTAs and SBIRs are going to be a great vehicle to do that.
Alec, if somebody wanted to get a hold of you, how would they go about doing that?
Yeah. Well, I think we have some contact information on the website. It's tradespace.io. But also feel free to reach out to me directly. My email is alec, ALEC, @tradespace.io. And we have a LinkedIn presence as well. We're trying to kind of post a lot of thought leadership around tech transfer. But please feel free to reach out, whether it's trying to understand a particular emerging technology landscape, whether it's developing strategy to get more value out of your own IP. We're really kind of excited to work with the ecosystem and to enable tech transfer and transition to the greatest extent possible.
Thanks, Alec. Anything else you'd like to add before we conclude today's LinkedIn Live event?
No, I would just want to say thanks to you, Mark, to SAE Government Technologies. It's really been, I think, a pleasure getting to know the organization, and I'm really excited, regardless of our partnership, just to see how SAE Government Technologies is able to, again, facilitate these new models for commercialization and tech transfer. So thanks again, and looking forward to working together in the future.
Thanks, Alec. I'm also looking forward to it. I can't wait to get into our next tech sprint. So thanks again for all your help. It's been great working with you. And like I said, I look forward to working with you more in the future. Take care. Have a good afternoon. Thanks for your time.
You too, Mark. Take care.
Bye-bye.